I'm just going to use this opportunity to talk about my film, which is out. It's called Cancel Nation, a documentary I made about feminism and woke culture in Sweden, where it coincides with uh, a lack of human rights for a large number of Muslim women, and it's a sort of a double thing in Scandinavia and in the rest of Europe, where the large number of migrants living in rather in their own worlds, as it were, coexisting with what they see as a Sodom and Gomorrah. And whereas many of us would kind of prefer some happy medium where it's neither too authoritarian nor too degenerate. And it's interesting how these things can coexist. And the main heroine of my film is a woman called Sahila Force, who has bought a block of flats, an old block of flats, and surrounded it by 3 meter high wiring. And she brought in a lot of Muslim women who'd been abused and beaten and tortured in some cases by their husbands, and restarted a new life for them. And some of them had their noses cut off. I mean, horrible, horrible things, but interesting. And I was inside this wiring. I mean, it's like, I don't know if you saw that film, 28 Weeks Later or something. It's like the sort of compound there where the zombies are waiting outside and trying to sort this compound. And I had sort of daydreams of these angry Muslim men doing that. And then you had these wives and their children inside. And this saint-like woman, Sahila Force, was protecting them, and she was getting some donations. But the point of the film was that she wasn't getting any attention from the state or any attention from Sweden's large cadre of feminist, bien-pensant, liberal, progressive journalists who are like their ilk all over the Western world, same as their journalist colleagues in The Guardian or The Washington Post. They called her a racist and an Islamophobe, even though Sohaila is a Muslim herself. Why? Because she deigned to comment some negatively. She wrote a book, I think, about how she'd fled Iran and the abuse she'd suffered under mullahs there and the religion and all the bad things. And she's lived that under all her life. But they wouldn't even talk to her because, of course, these people don't have any direct experience of the things that she's talked about and the people she's looking after. And she's saved a lot of people's lives. And these people, I don't know, they go. I don't see how they have the moral authority to lecture anyone about anything. They go from their coffees in the morning in the local cafe in Stockholm's well-heeled bohemian quarters and then knock out a few hundred words about the terrible far-right people threatening to swamp Sweden. You know, the Sweden's equivalent of the deplorables or the Trumpists, as it were, the old working class, you know, the ones that must be pressed down at every opportunity. But if you say anything about so-called authoritarian tendencies among the large number of Afghans or Persians or Iraqis coming, then you're out. You're not allowed to talk about that at all. So that was my film. You can find it if you Google Cancel Nation or you go onto YouTube. It's a Dutch company that's put it out there, and it's texted into English. So there's my plug.
Geopolitical commentator and investigative journalist. You're listening to Pelle Neroth Taylor on today's News Talk TNT.
Welcome to the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show on this Tuesday afternoon. Well, there's so much going on. We just don't know where to stop, where to start, even perhaps. Sometimes you just want to get off. Where's that famous thing? You stop the world, I want to get off. Was it a song or something? And you do want to do that sometimes. And of course, there are ways of tuning out or stopping the world briefly. Some people use drugs. Some people use meditation. But one way of calming down I've always been attracted to, even though I don't smoke, is taking a cigar or taking a pipe and sitting down and having a relaxing puff of my pipes, like J.R. Tolkien's Hobbits, or taking a cigar. There's a famous series of adverts in Britain for a cigar brand called Hamlet. And my dad was in British advertising and heavily involved in cigarette smoking advertising, and he won several awards for it. Some of the best advertising in the world was in Britain in the 1980s before tobacco advertising was banned. And the more restrictive the laws became, the more creative the adverts had to become, because they mustn't fall foul of the health and safety. But now I think they're so restrictive, or that it's quite impossible. But anyway, there's a fantastic series of adverts for Hamlet cigars where everything goes wrong for the protagonist, and one comic situation after the next, tragic comic situation. At the end, he just sits down, gives up, and takes a puff of his Hamlet cigar. I think that won a lot of awards, and it massively boosted the sales of that. And it's fun to be a bit politically incorrect sometimes in our health and safety obsessed world, to sometimes do the damnedest and take a drink and or have a cigar. So I've always been more interested in cigars, but I'll give a second nod to pipes, and all this is leading to is talking to one of the premier pipe experts of the world, perhaps Alan Harrelson, who's husband, father, farmer, and history professor, and owner of the Pipe Cottage. He runs a blog and a podcast on the art of smoking pipes, and he'll be with us after a short rundown of this afternoon's news at 20 past, I think, or slightly before. And then for the last 20 minutes, we've got Colonel John Mills, who is served right at the heart of the deep state and has rebelled against it, or he's seen it from the inside and he's not happy, and he wants to show the public out there, all of us, how to make things better and how to cure our addiction, or basically tamp down on the deep state's malign influence. He was a former director of cybersecurity policy strategy and international affairs at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So he knows what of he speaks. He's not just some kind of random blogger or a bloviator. And so he really knows. He's an expert, and he'll be telling us in the last 20 minutes. Do stick around for that. We're going to go into just a spot of foreign news. A lot of people realize, or have been reading the regular news, know that there's been an election in Venezuela, the country that just so happens sits on the world's largest oil reserves, and it's sitting within the remit of America's Monroe Doctrine, which for 200 years Americans have arrogated themselves the right to intervene in any country that even steps into the US zone of influence, which includes both North and South America. Cuba was an exception, but we know what happens back in 1962 when the Russians set up their nuclear missile sites pointed at America, and John F. Kennedy faced down Khrushchev in one of the most famous incidents in 20th century history. The Russians backed down, and the action. Well, we know now that the Americans did a promise on their turn, which was to never invade Cuba, and which they didn't do. So Castro sat around for another 60 years or 50 years, and they withdrew some of their own missiles on European or Turkish soil, actually. Anyway, the Cuba crisis is well known. Venezuela was once one of our South America, or the American double continent's richest countries, and then it fell into socialism and poverty, to put it, but equality. The opinions are very divided. I don't want to particularly dive into the merits of socialism versus capitalism. Hugo Chavez did a sort of Castro, brought wealth to the poorest, to his supporters, but did down the Venezuelan economy to his detractors. And the pushback there from the supporters say, well, that's only because of American sanctions and American rapaciousness. There might be an element of truth in both. Just because America does run an empire and is brutal towards people who oppose it and its corporate rights doesn't mean that local guys are ideal. What's happened, of course, is that Maduro, the successor to Chavez died in 2013, and is famous for wearing a sort of Castro, revolutionary cap, and with his wide grin and promising everything in the world to his poor base. He's replaced in 2013 by Nicolas Maduro, who's apparently won a third term on Sunday, having ruled in the spirit of Chavez. And he claims that he's just won the election and he's carrying on doing what he does best. He's brought the country's hyperinflation down. It was in the thousands of the percent in the last couple of years, down to 50%. And he's going to carry on with Chavismo, this hybrid system, which includes a lot of socialism. There are millions of exiles who've fled Venezuela, many of them living in North America. We had a guy on a couple of days ago, and they spit blood at the thought of Maduro and continuing to wreck and ruin his country. And the latest allegation is that the victory was fraudulently obtained. The National Electoral Council in Venezuela announced that with over 80% of votes counted, Maduro secured over 51% of the vote, and his opponent, Edmundo Gonzalez of the Democratic Unity Platform, received more than 44%. Now, I can well believe that was stolen, or fraudulently obtained. There are two ways to steal election. One is to steer and shape the conditions in which an election is conducted by controlling the media, by having people who harass you, or authoritarian presence on the streets, and remove access to ballots, provide condition on opposition candidates. All that happened here, apparently, to make it harder for the opposition to win. Of course, Maduro is claiming American intervention and interference to always. It's always goes both ways. I think Assad in Syria, a lot of his authoritarian measures had to be instituted because he was under attack from rebels, Islamists, paid for by the West. And of course, the Western media propaganda machine grinds into action and says, well, look, these guys are authoritarians, they shouldn't be allowed. But some of that authoritarianism is justifiable measures against foreign intervention. That said, I'm trying to take a hedging middle position here. Even if foreign intervention were absent, humanity is not divided into good countries and bad countries. There are bad leaders in all countries, as it were, and Maduro does seem to have run the country down. But I'm open to both interpretations.
From the Cold War to propaganda and the deep state, Pelle Neroth Taylor on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome to the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show on this Thursday afternoon, August the 29th. Well, hot news from Scandinavia. We're not only talking about war and all the depressing stuff. Well, it's sort of depressing in the sense that ABBA have just come out and said they're not going to allow Donald Trump to play their music at his rallies. Their ABBA's record label has said, together with the members of ABBA, we've discovered that videos have been come out. Videos have been showed where ABBA's music has been used by Trump's events. And we have demanded that their usage cease immediately. ABBA's not the only group that's been which Trump has used. Celine Dion, Bruce Springsteen, and Neil Young have also been used at his rallies, and have also demanded that he cease to use them. That's a pity. Apparently, they were playing "The Winner Takes It All." Of course, that's appropriate when Trump is going to increase people's faith and hope. It's interesting that this is Bruce Springsteen and Neil Young are kind of very American artists, very much aligned with America First, whereas, ABBA are distinctly Scandinavian with their brilliant songs, I think, incredibly melodious songs, which cover sort of male-female relations beyond the first blush, beyond the first love. The story really starts when you get married and doesn't end there, when people don't live just happily ever after, and the heartbreaks of divorce and young parenthood and drifting apart, and the ambivalence and ambiguities of male-female relations. Well, they capture that melancholy beautifully in their later songs. The best divorce music ever written, I say. In fact, they were at their best when the two couples had just divorced and they poured all their heartache. And make no mistake, it was a foursome. All four were, the girls were not just pretty faces. When Björn and Benny carried out their music, carried on collaborating as ever for decades, the music simply lost a lot of its magic. The girls had beautiful voices, and they had a lot of artistic input. Make no mistake about that. Anyway, but I think the artists should stick to music, not politics. I know that they backed the Feminist Party back in 2014 in Sweden. They went nowhere. Really stupid, radical feminist party, which is far more simplistic view of human female-male relations than ABBA's own songs. So they made a mistake there, and I think it's a mistake to go off against Trump, but politically correct and simplistic. On the world of big tech, we've got Mark Zuckerberg writing a letter to Jim Jordan, who is a congressman, and admitting that they're under pressure from Biden to censor the COVID discussion, including jokes and memes. Now, on my show, it's and many others here on TNT, I think we've talked to some of the top experts on the topic. I'm convinced that at the very least, the minimalist argument, I'll go with the minimalist and possibly the maximalist. The minimalist thing is it works very poorly. This vaccine doesn't prevent the spread and doesn't prevent the contraction, and it doesn't, and what it makes up for and reduced mortality from the actual COVID. It more than compensates for by increased other ailments, including various heart ailments. And there's an RCT, which you can check out. I said that always the go-to article is Martin Kuldorff's article in the City Journal, because he was a Harvard professor of epidemiology, studied this for 25 years. So when he recommends it, I think that's pretty good. And he's a Scandinavian, whatever that means. He knows his stuff, and he quoted an article, another Scandinavian randomized controlled trial that shows his links to it. It's published in a well-known journal, saying that the vaccines have zero effect on mortality. But then you could obviously go to people like Robert Malone, Alex Berenson, Ed Dowd, Naomi Wolf, Peter McCullough. They've all been on this show. Sorry, 2 or 3 of them have been on the show, and it's worth going back into my archives to listen to them. And of course, they're all over X. Anyway, he also confessed that they'd censored the Biden laptop story, which could have contributed, in my view, to Trump losing the election, since the knowledge of Biden's financial shenanigans may have shifted important votes to Trump. That's on top of the fact that Facebook funded a lot of the election doodahs, whatever you want to call it, get out and vote. Some people, it's borderline corruption. Some things people think is the part of the overall Steal campaign. And so there's a general sort of rowing back on that. And of course, he blamed that the FBI briefed him in 2020 that this Biden laptop was Russian disinformation. But of course, as Andrew McCarthy pointed out, he's a well-known legal scholar. I think he was talking on Fox News, was it yesterday, saying, well, the FBI had the laptop since 2019. So they knew that for a year that it came from this computer shop. It wasn't Russian disinformation. They could cross-check all the information on that laptop. So they were lying. And they were basically affecting election suppression via Facebook. Now, it's interesting to see whether he's got second thoughts now. Dear old Zuckerberg, I've noticed on Facebook, seemed to be much less censoring and censorious, much more open. Is he taking a leaf out of Elon Musk's book, realizing that free speech is quite good for business? It's a good look. Is he anticipating a Trump administration and wants to be in their good books? Well, who knows? Anyway, kind of related to that is a great article I saw called The Meeting Industrial Complex. We've got the military industrial complex, which you talk about extensively on this show. Well, the Meeting Industrial Complex is all these endless Zoom conversations that the modern white-collar worker working at home has to engage in. This article says, on a given weekday, the share of the labor force working from home is roughly 4 times higher than it was before the pandemic. At no point in modern history have so many workers spent so much time in a room by themselves during the weekday. But how much of that time is truly alone in the absence of people's faces and voices? By some measures, our colleagues are with us more than ever, whether or not we like it that way. The share of the typical white-collar workday spent in meetings has steadily increased for the past few decades and continues to grow day by day. But the private data suggests we are deluged. In 2016, a small group of researchers calculated that the time spent in meetings had increased by 50% since the 1990s. Collaboration is taking over in the workplace, they wrote in an article in the Harvard Business Review. But buried under an avalanche of requests for input or advice, some workers are spending so much time in meetings, taking calls, and combing through their inbox that their work has to wait until their real work had to wait until they got home in the evenings. So wall-to-wall meetings from 9 to 5 or pushing away creative or individual work to a period after dinner. In 2022, Microsoft researchers published a study that tracked workers using the company's software. They discovered that a miniature workday was forming in the late evening. About 1/3 of their workers in their studies were as likely to work at 10 p.m. as they were at 8 a.m. The reason, when the pandemic sent knowledge workers home, official meetings replaced casual interacting actions and made it impossible for many people to get things done unless they found time to log back online after dinner.
With your help, we can continue to fight for freedom, reach new audiences, and bring important information to the public free of charge. This is not possible without your generosity. Join our quest for the truth and our freedom and donate today. Simply go to tntradio.live. Swedish-British journalist, filmmaker, political writer, and author of 5 books, Pelle Neroth Taylor, on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome to the Pelle Neroth Taylor Show on this Monday afternoon here in Europe. Well, we've got the big event of the week, I guess, is the Trump-Kamala Harris debate. I think it's tomorrow. And it's interesting that the New York Times, which is not known as a fan of Trump, had commissioned a poll, which it published yesterday, showing that Donald Trump is maintaining his lead nationally, saying that he's shrugged off the burst of enthusiasm for the Democrats after Kamala Harris entered the race. We had a very brief bout there. So he's got the support of 48% of likely supporters, according to the New York Times Siena poll, compared to 47% support for Harris. And now that's practically identical to the preferences in the aftermath of President Biden dropping out of the race in late July. So we're back where we started. Now, please do note that the Democrats need to win by 3 or 4% in the popular vote nationwide to get a guaranteed victory in the Electoral College, because of the concentration of their support in the big states like California and so on, which means that there's a kind of bias towards the Republicans in the system. So Trump is even further ahead, I think, in the swing states. But of course, I think that we've talked so much about election steals in this, and that issue still isn't resolved. But it is a positive thing, and we'll see if, as some people on my show have said, make it too big to rig, as it were. Right. Well, we've got 2 excellent guests. We've got Eric Krauss on very shortly. He and I are going to talk about Churchill. And why are we going to talk about Churchill? Well, I'll explain why. There's a big, its Twitter sphere has exploded, mostly in anger, when Tucker Carlson interviewed quite a well-known historian of populist bent called Darryl Cooper, who's, as a result of the controversy generated in that interview, mostly critical of Churchill, who's a sort of icon, of course, in the Atlantic world. He's soared to the second most popular podcaster on Spotify, and one of after Joe Rogan. So controversy is the thing. I'll try and be as controversial as possible on this show. Well, why was he so controversial? Well, he said that Churchill was basically a villain, a scoundrel, a man-child who played with his toys into adult age, and a psychopath and a racist. Well, these are not, he wasn't mincing his words. And of course, there are a lot of people for whom Churchill is up in there in the pantheon, along with Lincoln and George Washington. I mean, he's a Brit, actually half American. I think his mother was an American carpetbagger who came looking for aristocrats in their country estates back when America was the supplicant in the late 1880s. Anyway, this half American Winston Churchill is up there in the American pantheon. And Dick Cheney was, of course, his biggest fan in U.S. politics. And when he was vice president, of course, his Bush was president, there was a bust of Churchill in the White House. And the neocon fanboys often cited Churchill during America's period of unipolar hegemony from 1990s for the next 2 decades, the War on Terror. Well, the thing is, what everyone knows about Churchill, what everyone quotes in the foreign policy debate, which was so sterile in those years, in my view, was 2 things. First of all, appeasement doesn't work. So the one thing everyone knows about 20th century European diplomacy was that you had 2 guys. You had Neville Chamberlain, who was a weak, tea-drinking, wet, sniffly kind of guy who wanted to talk to bad guys, i.e. dictator. And then you had Churchill, who was a doughty fighter for empire and was a very good guy who could see evil for what it was. And when he prevailed, when the Brits got their act together and kicked out Neville Chamberlain, who was, appeasement is one thing that people know. He appeased Hitler back in 1938, and as a result of that appeasement, Hitler annexed the Czechoslovakia, or the Czech lands, because Slovakia became an independent republic. And he then set his sights on Poland. And so then the Brits said stop. And although Neville Chamberlain was the man who actually declared war, he prosecuted the Norwegian came badly. Norway was the next target in Hitler's evil sights, followed by Belgium, Denmark, and all the rest of it. And then they got Churchill in, and he prosecuted the war to its very end. And you can't, almost every debate in the last 20 or 30 years has been framed according to those, even the Ukraine war. And the problem with that is that it leaves out a lot of complexities. And Churchill, well, for a start, Neville Chamberlain did do some rearmament. I don't want to go too much into the origins of World War II, because it's actually quite a complicated issue. I mean, the Poles were being G'd up by Roosevelt across the Atlantic to be as obstreperous as possible to the Germans, who actually, on nationality grounds, had the full right to Danzig. And Hitler was not only a bad guy, but he was also a German statesman. And going back to the 1920s, the Germans wanted their territories back in Eastern Europe. The Poles had treated their Germans extremely badly. I mean, they ended up, after 1919, they came out of nowhere. The Poles hadn't had a country for 2.5 centuries. They fought the Russians to get back territory that was Belarusian and Ukrainian. So they had a lot of Belarusians and Ukrainians who didn't want to be part of their country. And then on the west side, they had a lot of Germans who didn't want to be their country. And they treated these minorities abominably badly. So having been treated badly by the great powers, having been wiped off the map for 2.5 centuries with Poles in Germany and Russia, they proceeded to treat their own minorities badly. And this was no recipe for harmony. And they were the most anti-Semitic country in Europe after Germany in the 1930s. So there were no queens and no angels, I should say. But Neville Chamberlain issued a guarantee, which the British couldn't possibly support militarily, because they had a tiny army and Poland was on the other side of Europe. But it was, in a way, you can see there are parallels with Europe today, what's going on with Ukraine in the place of Poland, perhaps trying to get the larger powers in. But Britain also, once Hitler had won the conflict in Europe, on continental Europe, had basically defeated the Britain, as it were, and Britain was basically unconquerable. I mean, the Germans didn't have a large fleet that could actually prosecute Operation Sea Lion. But the Brits waited it out. They carried out random terrorist attacks. They were the ones who started large-scale bombing, and they were kind of goading the Germans to bomb Britain. And the Bradley Cooper, Tucker Carlson's interview, he made the point that the Brits were basically waiting for the Americans and the Russians to bail them out, and that was not a very honorable or noble thing to do, because they were creating a situation where we should be dragging the Americans into war. Now, just setting aside the goodness or badness of Hitler for the moment, you could say that this was an echo of what the Brits did in 1913, 1914, which was a completely different kettle of fish, morally speaking. There was no Hitler. The Kaiser was quite a good guy, I think, and the British had been goading the Germans for 20 years. Germany was the China of its time, just as Britain was the America of its time. It was a rising country, and Britain was a declining country. And basically, they got the Brits and the Russians and the French all kind of squeezing Germany in. And Germany was winning all the Nobel Prizes. They just wanted to trade and be as successful as all the other countries have been allowed to be. Britain had a vast empire, which was having some difficulty to maintain, and the Germans were just too good for their own good. And Churchill played a huge role in making World War I happen, because he mobilized the Royal Navy without consulting his cabinet. And there are quotes all over the place in the literature about how Churchill was saying he couldn't help but loving war. And he told his wife, "It's my constitution that makes it this. May God forgive me," sort of thing. And he really welcomed war. They were playing cards in Downing Street and counting down the hours for when the Germans would respond. But when Churchill mobilized the fleet, that was a signal to the French that they could go ahead and push Russia and themselves into a war by refusing to back down when they'd already started mobilizing on the Russian side of the frontier, and the French had two. The Germans actually mobilized last of all the major powers because they couldn't have these two great powers on their border, even though they're the first to cross into the border of Belgium. If you look into literature, I've written a book about it. It's quite clear that it was the Germans attacked first, but the Allied powers were the provokers of that conflict, and no one pressed the button that made the war possible more than Churchill, with his mobilization of the Royal Navy, which secretly behind his cabinet's back, it's supposed to be a cabinet decision. He was the Royal Secretary of the Navy, or the First Sea Lord, and a million other small things. He made sure that the Tories, of whom he was once a member, were on board for war. So one of the liberal reasons why they didn't want to not go to war was that there would have been war anyway if the Tories came in and formed a coalition government. And Winston Churchill was the behind-scenes coordinator of that. And the World War I was the catastrophe, the great catastrophe of the 20th century. So just looking at that war, you can make a good claim that Churchill was one of the bad guys, certainly. But what Bradley Cooper has said is that I'm glad he's occasioned the debate, might 100% historically correct, but if Britain had listened to the peace overtures from Hitler in 1940, there wouldn't have been the vast war in Eastern Europe and the attack on Barbarossa, the Russian campaign, which led to the slaughter of all peoples, including, of course, the Jews, but also Belarusians and Poles and all the rest of it. And maybe the world would have looked totally different today. It's quite a provocative thesis, but I'm so glad that now, in a time when Eastern Europe once again is in the focus of all our attention, and for some of us who've read our history, it's remarkably similar to the run-up to war earlier in the last century, as if we never learn our history, even though we're so advanced, humanistic and modern, that I'm glad that it's now the number one trending issue on Twitter, and hopefully I'll come back to the issue more, as I think I have special knowledge, particularly of Churchill and Britain and the West's behavior in the First World War. Second World War is still a toxic and dangerous minefield, and I haven't specialized too much on that. Anyway, we've got Eric Krauss with us after the breaks, and we're going to talk about Churchill from a French perspective, and also other developments in Ukraine and Russia after the break. This is the Pelle and Neroth Tele Show on TNT News Talk.
Lies. We're being told lies by greedy foreign developers who want to build renewable energy projects in Australia. They are not good for the environment. Thousands of hectares of productive farmland will be cleared and native wildlife will die. These developments promise clean energy, but at what cost? Let's help protect our communities and their irreplaceable way of life. Let's rethink renewables. Take 2 minutes to learn the truth about the destruction they cause. Go to letsrethinkrenewables.org.
Climate change policies will only widen the gap between the rich and the poor. We're today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to the Pelle and Neroth Tele Show. Well, I've said the biggest lesson I learned from writing my book about World War I is the aggressor is not necessarily the one who fires the first shot. Just as little as an abused woman is the aggressor because she hits back finally after somebody gaslights them for a very long time. Gaslighting, I think, is what the Entente powers did against Germany in 1914. And the other thing I learned is that the heroes of the past are certainly not heroes once you dig into the archives. And it's funnily enough, it's almost anything you dig into historically, it turns out that the mainstream view of it bears questioning, and that's what we do a lot on this TNT show. We won't get them all, but we'll get some of them at least, and give you listeners and viewers a better idea of what's really gone on in the 20th century.